Around the campfire, 6 terrifying stories are told, each one darker than the last. Invisible creatures, footprints appearing out of nowhere, and supernatural attacks turn the peacefulness of nature into a nightmarish ordeal. What started as a simple camping trip becomes a desperate fight against the unknown, where the silence of the forest hides unspeakable horrors. The dense, towering forests of northern Alberta seemed endless. The ancient trees swayed gently in the cold wind, their branches creaking like old bones, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. The group of 6 campers sat huddled around a flickering fire, its flames snapping and popping as it fought against the creeping cold of the autumn night. David Pierce, the eldest of the group at 31, sat closest to the fire, poking at the embers with a stick. His square jaw and short-cropped brown hair gave him a rugged, dependable look, and the group naturally followed his lead. His younger sister, Sarah, sat to his left, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, not just for warmth, but to keep her nerves at bay. She had never been a fan of the wilderness, especially not this far north, where the vast boreal forest felt like a place untouched by time. Jake, their guide, leaned back in his chair. His flannel shirt and worn boots spoke to years of experience outdoors. He had spent half his life in these woods, hunting, fishing, and guiding city folks through the unforgiving terrain. His eyes scanned the dark tree line, always alert, as if expecting something to emerge from the forest at any moment. Next to him were Mike and Tyler Ross, 2 brothers from Seattle. Mike was the quiet one, always observing, rarely speaking, while Tyler, the younger of the 2, was more animated, his mouth constantly moving, a nervous habit that everyone had learned to tune out. Amanda Cross, the last of the group, was David's old flame from college, the one who had convinced him to gather their old friends for this trip. She was adventurous but cautious, her light blonde hair catching the firelight as she pulled it back into a ponytail, her hazel eyes betraying a hint of unease. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the chilly night air. The only sounds beyond the fire were the occasional hoot of an owl and the whisper of wind weaving through the trees. The wilderness around them was eerily still, the kind of silence that made people nervous, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "All right, it's time," David said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was low, but it carried a sense of anticipation. He tossed another log into the fire, and the flames surged higher, casting long shadows across their faces. "Who's got a story? A real one. None of that campfire nonsense." "No thanks," Sarah muttered, pulling her hoodie tighter. She had always hated this part of camping, the ghost stories, the dark woods. It reminded her too much of the unknown, of the things people couldn't explain. "Let's not make this any creepier than it already is." Tyler grinned. "Come on, Sarah. It's all part of the experience. You know, scare ourselves half to death before bed." "Shut up, Tyler," Mike said, shooting him a glare. He was always the protective older brother, but even he couldn't help but feel the weight of the night pressing in on them. The wilderness felt too vast, too empty, and the deeper they had ventured into the forest, the more isolated they had become. Jake cleared his throat, his eyes still fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. "You all ever hear about the hikers that went missing up in these parts?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made everyone sit up a little straighter. "Missing hikers?" Amanda echoed, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "You're joking, right?" Jake didn't smile. "No joke. This area's notorious for it. Been happening for decades. People come out here, camping, hiking, and then one day, they just disappear. No trace, no bodies. Search parties go out, find their gear, sometimes even their camps, but never the people." "Okay, that's enough," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. She shot a look at David, silently pleading with him to change the subject. But her brother was grinning, enjoying the rising tension. "What do you think happens to them?" David asked, his eyes locked on Jake. Jake shrugged, the firelight casting eerie shadows across his weathered face. Could be a lot of things. Bears, wolves, the cold, or something else. People around here have their stories. Talk about strange sightings, weird noises in the night, lights in the sky. Things that don't make sense. The group fell silent, the crackling fire the only sound between them. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving the forest in an oppressive stillness. Amanda shifted in her seat, casting a nervous glance over her shoulder, as if half expecting to see something standing there in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the firelight. "It's all local superstition," Mike said, trying to sound reasonable, though his voice lacked conviction. "There's always an explanation." Jake's eyes narrowed. "Is there?" Another heavy silence followed. Even Tyler, usually the loudest, had gone quiet. It was as if the trees themselves were listening, waiting for the next word. David leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper, drawing the others in closer. "Actually, I've got a story. A true one. And it happened not too far from where we are now." Everyone turned toward him, the firelight reflecting off their wide eyes. Sarah stiffened in her seat, knowing all too well how David loved to twist reality to scare people. But this time, something in his tone unnerved her. He wasn't joking. "A group of friends, like us, came camping up here about 20 years ago. They were experienced, knew the area well. One night, they're sitting around the fire, much like this, when something strange happens. Around 2:30, maybe 3 in the morning, the dogs they brought with them start acting weird, barking, growling at something in the trees. But they can't see anything. Just the darkness. The group feels it too, this presence. Like something's watching them. Circling them." Tyler leaned in closer, his face tense. "What was it?" David's smile faded, his expression growing grim. "No one knows. That night, one of them vanished. Just disappeared. They found his gear in the morning, his pack, his boots, everything right where he left them. But him? Gone. No signs of a struggle. No tracks. No blood. Just gone." A chill crept through the group as the fire flickered lower. Even Jake, who had heard countless stories, seemed unsettled. The night had grown colder, the kind of biting cold that made its way through layers of clothing and settled in your bones. "So, what happened to him?" Amanda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David's eyes flicked toward the dark forest. "They never found him. And the search parties that came later? They say some of them went missing too. It's like, whatever's out there doesn't want to be found." The fire popped loudly, startling everyone. Amanda jumped, glancing nervously at the dark forest surrounding them. The shadows seemed to be shifting now, moving with a life of their own, creeping closer to the firelight. Jake spoke again, his voice lower this time. "I've heard that story too. More than once." The wind picked up, rustling the branches high above them. It was almost as if the forest had come alive, listening, watching, waiting. And somewhere, deep in the woods, there was a soft sound. A distant, low growl that made the hair on the back of their necks stand on end. The soft growl echoed faintly from the depths of the forest, barely audible over the crackling of the campfire. For a moment, it could have been mistaken for the wind weaving through the trees, but Jake knew better. He sat up straighter, his hand instinctively moving to the hunting knife strapped to his side. His eyes scanned the tree line, searching for movement, for any sign of what could have made that noise. But the forest remained still, save for the occasional flicker of shadows cast by the fire. Did anyone else hear that?" Amanda's voice trembled as she asked the question no one wanted to admit. Sarah's head snapped toward her brother. "David, this isn't funny. What the hell was that?" David's grin from earlier had vanished. He looked toward Jake, the man who had spent countless nights in these woods, hoping for some reassurance. but the look on Jake's face told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't part of the game. It could have been a coyote, Mike offered, though even he didn't sound convinced. The brothers exchanged nervous glances. Tyler, always the first to crack a joke, sat motionless, his hand clenched tightly around the handle of his flashlight. Jake stood slowly, his boots crunching softly on the dried leaves beneath him. His movements were deliberate, quiet, as if he didn't want to draw attention to himself. The group watched as he took a few steps closer to the edge of the clearing, where the light of the fire gave way to an impenetrable wall of darkness. His eyes scanned the forest, and for the first time that night, Jake looked worried. "What is it?" David asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. His eyes followed Jake, the tension in his voice betraying his calm facade. Jake raised a hand, signaling for silence. He listened. The forest, once filled with the chirping of crickets and the rustling of nocturnal creatures, had gone completely silent. It was as if the presence of their group had disturbed something that now watched them from the safety of the shadows. "It's too quiet," Jake muttered, almost to himself. He took another step toward the dark tree line, but before he could get any closer, there was a sudden, sharp snap, a branch breaking deep within the woods. Everyone froze. "Jake?" Amanda's voice was small, barely more than a whisper. He didn't respond. His hand tightened around his knife, eyes locked on the spot where the sound had come from. For a long moment, no one moved. It was as if the entire world had been reduced to the soft crackling of the fire and the oppressive silence that hung over the clearing. And then, from the same spot where the branch had snapped, there came a second sound, closer this time. A distinct, deliberate crunch of leaves. Something, or someone, was out there. "Get back to the fire," Jake ordered, his voice low but urgent. He didn't wait for the others to react. With quick, measured steps, he returned to the circle of chairs, his eyes never leaving the darkness beyond the light of the flames. The others obeyed, moving closer to the fire, as if the flames would somehow protect them from whatever was lurking in the woods. Sarah shivered uncontrollably, her hands trembling as she clutched her jacket tighter around her body. "I don't like this, Dave," she muttered, her eyes wide with fear. "This isn't normal. We should go back to the cars." "We're miles from the nearest road," Jake said grimly, not taking his eyes off the trees. "No way we're making it through the woods in the dark without someone getting hurt." "Besides," David added, trying to sound braver than he felt, "we don't even know what it is. Could just be a deer or a raccoon." "A deer doesn't break branches like that," Jake snapped, his voice tense. "And whatever it is, it's watching us." The fire flared suddenly as a gust of wind blew through the clearing, making the shadows around them dance violently. The group instinctively huddled closer together, the warmth of the flames doing little to calm their growing fear. Amanda reached into her backpack and pulled out a small flashlight, its weak beam cutting through the darkness, though not far enough to provide any real comfort. "Let's just keep calm," David said, though his voice was shaky. "We've been out here all day, right? No one's seen anything weird until now. It's probably nothing." Jake shook his head. "No, it's something. I've been out in these woods more times than I can count, and this is different." His voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible over the crackling fire. "Something's out there. And it's not afraid of us." For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the hiss of the fire and the occasional rustle of the trees. Sarah's breathing had become shallow and rapid, her eyes darting from side to side, searching for any sign of movement in the dark. She opened her mouth to speak, but her words caught in her throat as another sound cut through the night air, a low, guttural growl, unmistakably closer this time. "That's not a coyote," Tyler said, his voice cracking. He was gripping his flashlight so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "That's not any animal I've ever heard." The growl came again, louder, deeper. It seemed to reverberate through the clearing, sending a chill down everyone's spine. The firelight flickered, and for a brief moment, the shadows around them seemed to grow taller, more menacing. David grabbed a nearby branch and shoved it into the fire, trying to stoke the flames higher. "We need more light," he muttered, his voice betraying his rising panic. "We need to see what the hell's out there." But no amount of light would help. The darkness beyond the clearing was too thick, too impenetrable. Whatever was out there, it was staying just out of reach, waiting for the right moment. Jake stood, his face grim. "Everyone stay close to the fire," he said quietly. "Don't wander off. If we're lucky, it'll pass." Amanda's eyes widened. "Pass? What do you think it is, Jake?" He didn't answer. Suddenly, from somewhere in the woods, there was a rapid series of sharp, snapping sounds, branches breaking, leaves crunching, as if something large was moving through the underbrush with unnatural speed. The group tensed, their eyes darting toward the source of the noise, but they saw nothing. Only the darkness. "It's moving," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Circling us." "Jesus Christ," Mike muttered, his hand trembling as he reached for the hatchet he had brought along for chopping firewood. "What do we do, Jake? What the hell do we do?" For the first time that night, Jake didn't have an answer. His years of experience in the wilderness suddenly felt useless. He had faced bears, wolves, even mountain lions, but this was something else. Something he had no name for. The snapping stopped. The forest fell silent once more, the stillness even more suffocating than before. Everyone held their breath, listening, waiting. The wind had died completely, and the fire's light seemed to shrink, the flames growing smaller, dimmer, as if the very air around them was being drained of warmth and life. Then, from the darkness, a single sound pierced the silence, a heavy, deliberate footstep. It was closer now. Much closer. And it wasn't alone. The footstep echoed through the clearing, sending a chill down the spine of every camper. It wasn't the sound of a small animal creeping through the underbrush. It was heavy, deliberate. The kind of step that suggested something large, something powerful, and aware of their presence. "Jake," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "What's out there?" Jake remained silent, his eyes fixed on the darkness. His breath was steady, but there was a tension in his body that none of them had seen before. Even Tyler, who was usually the first to panic, noticed the shift in Jake's demeanor. The man who had been their rock all evening, their guide in the wilderness, was now on edge. David stood slowly, gripping the makeshift torch he'd created by shoving the branch into the fire. The flames danced at the end of the stick, casting flickering shadows across his face. His jaw was clenched, his muscles taut with anxiety. He wasn't sure if he was trying to convince himself or the others when he spoke next. "It's probably just an animal," he said, his voice lacking the confidence he had earlier. "We'll scare it off with the fire. Animals don't like fire, right?" But Jake shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the tree line. "That's no animal." Another footstep, closer this time. The crunch of dead leaves underfoot made them all flinch. It was deliberate, measured, as if whatever was out there wanted them to know it was getting nearer. Amanda's breathing became shallow, her fingers trembling as she clutched her flashlight like a lifeline. "Maybe it's a person," Mike suggested, though he knew how ridiculous it sounded. They were miles away from any trails, deep in the wilderness. What person would be out here, walking alone in the dark, without any light? "A person doesn't sound like that," Jake muttered under his breath. The group huddled closer to the fire, the heat of the flames doing little to ease the cold fear creeping into their bones. The darkness beyond the firelight seemed thicker now, as if the forest itself had closed in around them, cutting off any escape. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her pulse so loud in her ears that she could barely hear anything else. She wanted to run, to bolt for the safety of the cars, even if it meant plunging into the unknown darkness. But her legs felt like lead, frozen in place by the terror that gripped her. Then, without warning, a flash of movement caught their attention, a shadow darting between the trees, just on the edge of the firelight. It was fast, too fast to be anything human. The group gasped in unison, their eyes wide with fear. "There!" Amanda cried, pointing toward the spot where she'd seen the movement. Her voice was shrill, breaking under the weight of her fear. "Did you see it? Something's out there." David turned in the direction she pointed, raising the flaming branch higher, but there was nothing, just a dense, black wall of trees that surrounded them. The fire crackled louder, as if in response to the mounting tension, but no one moved. They were trapped, glued to the spot, their bodies locked in fear. "I didn't see anything," Tyler whispered, though his eyes darted frantically from tree to tree. "What the hell was that?" "You didn't see it?" Amanda's voice was trembling. "It was right there, right on the edge of the firelight. It was huge." Jake swore under his breath. He had seen it too. Whatever was out there wasn't just toying with them anymore, it was moving in, slowly, testing their defenses. His hand gripped the hilt of his knife tighter, but he knew that wouldn't do much against something they couldn't even see clearly. Suddenly, the air felt heavier, as though a storm was gathering around them. The wind, which had died moments earlier, picked up again, swirling through the trees with an eerie wail. The flames of the fire danced wildly, casting erratic shadows that made the dark forest seem alive with movement. It was as if the woods were breathing, a cold, unnatural breath that carried whispers none of them could fully hear but all could feel. Sarah shuddered. "We need to go," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "We need to leave now." "And go where?" Mike asked, his voice tight with fear. "We can't see a damn thing out there. Whatever that is, it knows these woods better than we do." Another snap, closer now. The sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. Then a low, guttural growl rumbled from the shadows, this time unmistakably near. It was deep, primal, the kind of sound that made every instinct scream for survival. Jake's eyes darted from side to side, scanning the woods as his pulse quickened. Everyone grab something, sticks, anything. "We can't let it think we're easy prey." Amanda scrambled to pick up a thick branch, her hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped it. Mike and Tyler followed suit, hastily gathering whatever they could find nearby. Sarah clutched her phone in one hand, desperately trying to get a signal, but there was nothing, just the cold, mocking absence of any connection to the outside world. "David," Jake said quietly, his voice low and steady. "We can't stay here. Whatever it is, it's getting bolder. We're too exposed." David nodded, though he had no idea where they could go. His mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but nothing made sense. The woods were a maze, and they were trapped in the middle of it. The nearest road was at least a 2-hour hike, even in daylight, and they had no idea what direction to take. The growl came again, this time so close it felt like the air itself was vibrating. Something was just beyond the light, hiding in the shadows, waiting. Amanda's breath hitched, her knuckles white as she gripped her branch like a weapon. "Stay close," David said, though his voice wavered. "We stick together, no one goes off alone." But as the words left his mouth, something lunged from the darkness, a blur of movement so fast and so sudden that none of them had time to react. The thing crashed into the fire pit, scattering embers and burning wood in every direction. The fire flared violently, momentarily blinding them as sparks flew into the air, but in that split second, they saw it. A hulking shadow, too large to be any normal animal, its form barely visible in the brief, flickering light. It moved on all fours, but its limbs were too long, its movements too unnatural. And its eyes, reflective, glowing with a sickly, yellow light, stared directly at them, full of hunger. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, retreating back into the darkness, leaving the group frozen in shock. "What the hell was that?" Tyler screamed, stumbling backward, nearly tripping over his chair. "Did you see it?" Amanda was nearly hyperventilating, her eyes wide with terror. "What the hell is that thing?" Jake's face was pale, his jaw clenched as he stared into the woods. "I don't know. But it's not leaving." The fire had been scattered, its flames now weak and sputtering as they struggled to hold on to the last few pieces of unburnt wood. Darkness pressed in on them from all sides, and the creature, whatever it was out there, circling, watching. David turned toward Jake, his voice low and urgent. "What do we do?" For the first time, Jake didn't have an answer. The creature's sudden attack had shattered any remaining illusion of safety. Embers from the scattered fire glowed dimly in the dark, barely illuminating the terrified faces of the campers. The thing they had glimpsed, hulking, unnatural, and impossibly fast, was still out there, lurking just beyond the shrinking circle of light. David's heart hammered in his chest, his mind racing. The torch he held was nearly useless now, the flames flickering weakly at the tip. He could still see the glowing yellow eyes in his mind, reflecting the light of the fire as they locked onto him for that brief, terrifying moment. "We need to get that fire going again," Jake said, his voice tight, but controlled. He moved quickly, gathering the scattered logs and placing them back into the fire pit. "Whatever that thing is, it doesn't like the light. We keep the fire strong, and we stay close." Amanda crouched next to him, frantically tossing smaller branches onto the pile, her hands shaking so badly that she fumbled several sticks. "We can't just sit here." "That thing," she choked on her words, panic rising in her throat. "Calm down." Jake snapped, his eyes burning with intensity as he glanced at her. "Panicking is exactly what it wants. We stay calm, we stick together, and we get through this." Mike was frozen, gripping his hatchet tightly, his face pale in the dying light. Tyler, beside him, was mumbling incoherently, repeating the same phrase over and over under his breath. "It's watching us, it's watching us." Sarah, who had been standing closest to David, stared at the smoldering fire, her lips quivering. "What the hell is that thing, Dave?" she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "What's happening?" "I don't know," David replied, his voice rough with fear. He couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze. "But we need to keep the fire alive. Just focus on that." With quick movements, Jake sparked his lighter and reignited the flames. The fire roared back to life, sending a wave of warmth through the clearing and momentarily pushing the darkness back. The light cast long, dancing shadows on the trees, but none of them felt safe. Jake scanned the tree line, his knife still gripped in one hand. "We can't stay out here all night. It'll pick us off. We need a plan." Amanda looked up from the fire, her voice shaking. "A plan? What plan? We can't outrun that thing. You saw how fast it was." Jake gritted his teeth. He was usually the one with all the answers, the one people turned to in dangerous situations, but now, he was at a loss. "We head back to the cars," he finally said, his voice low but firm. "It's about 2 miles north, through the forest. If we stay together, keep moving fast and keep the light going, we might be able to make it." 2 miles in the dark? Tyler's voice was rising with panic. "That thing's out there waiting for us. We won't make it halfway." "Then you stay here and see how long you last," Jake shot back, his patience wearing thin. "It's our only chance." David looked around at the group, their faces pale in the flickering firelight. Sarah was trembling, her eyes wide and filled with fear. Amanda looked on the verge of tears. Even Mike, always calm under pressure, seemed unsteady. And Tyler looked like he was barely holding it together, his breathing shallow and rapid, his eyes darting frantically toward the dark edges of the forest. "We stick together," David said, forcing his voice to sound confident. "We stay close, we keep the fire going, and we don't stop. We make it to the cars, we get out of here." Jake nodded. "Everyone grab what you can. We'll take a couple of these burning logs for light. If it comes at us, we fight it off." Mike finally found his voice. "Fight it off with what? A couple of sticks and a knife? That thing's a monster." "We don't have a choice, Mike," David said, his voice steady but tense. "We move now." The group scrambled to gather their gear. Amanda grabbed the flashlight again, though its beam seemed pitiful against the black wall of the forest. Jake hefted a burning log from the fire, using it as a torch, while David did the same. Mike held onto his hatchet like a lifeline, while Sarah gripped a heavy branch with both hands, trying to steady her shaking arms. Tyler was still mumbling under his breath, his eyes wide with terror, but David grabbed him by the shoulders and shook him. "Tyler, focus. We need you." Tyler blinked, snapping out of his daze for a moment. He nodded slowly, his breath still ragged. Yeah, okay." With the fire now reduced to a few glowing embers and the torches blazing in their hands, the group began to move toward the narrow path that led deeper into the woods. The darkness closed in quickly, pressing in on them from all sides. The only sounds were the crackling of the burning logs and their own heavy breathing. The air was thick with tension, and every rustle of the wind through the trees made them flinch. They walked in silence for several minutes, their steps slow and deliberate. The path was narrow, winding through thick underbrush and towering pines. The forest seemed alive with whispers, the wind weaving through the trees in strange patterns, carrying sounds that didn't quite belong. "What if it's following us?" Amanda whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's following us," Jake replied grimly, his eyes scanning the dark woods. "But as long as we stay together, we'll be okay." But even as he said the words, he wasn't sure if he believed them. Suddenly, a loud snap echoed through the trees, something heavy moving quickly through the underbrush behind them. The group stopped dead in their tracks, their hearts pounding in their chests. David spun around, raising his torch, the flames casting wild shadows across the trees. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. They all heard it. The sound of something large, moving fast, getting closer. Jake turned, his face set with grim determination. "Keep moving. Don't stop." But it was too late. From the darkness behind them, the creature lunged again, this time faster, more aggressive. They barely had time to react. David raised his torch, trying to ward it off, but the thing was too quick. It slammed into the side of a tree, snarling, a deep, guttural sound that sent a wave of terror through the group. David caught only a glimpse of it in the torchlight, a massive, shadowy form, all muscle and sinew, its limbs long and twisted, its eyes glowing with that unnatural, sickly yellow light. It let out a roar, an inhuman, bone-rattling sound that echoed through the forest. "Run!" Jake shouted. The group bolted, terror propelling them forward into the dark. The path was narrow, branches tearing at their clothes as they pushed through the dense undergrowth. David's heart raced as he ran, his torch swinging wildly in front of him, casting fleeting light on the trees ahead. He could hear the creature behind them, crashing through the forest with terrifying speed, its growls growing louder, closer. Sarah screamed as she stumbled, nearly falling into the dirt, but David grabbed her arm, pulling her up. "Come on, we're almost there," he yelled, though he had no idea if that was true. Behind them, the creature was gaining. It moved through the trees like a predator on the hunt, its movements too fast, too fluid to be anything natural. The group's footsteps were frantic now, their breathing ragged as they ran for their lives. Then, just as it seemed like the creature was about to close the distance, Jake stopped suddenly, skidding to a halt. "There," he yelled, pointing ahead. Through the trees, they could just make out a small clearing, an open space in the dense forest. The cars. "We can make it!" David shouted, his voice filled with desperate hope. But as they sprinted toward the clearing, the creature let out another roar, this time so close it felt like it was right behind them. And then, out of the darkness, something lunged. The creature's roar tore through the night like a jagged blade, sending waves of terror coursing through the group. Their legs burned as they sprinted toward the clearing, branches whipping their faces and clothes as they plunged deeper into the dark forest. The cars were just ahead, barely visible through the trees, but so was the creature, gaining on them with every second. David's breath came in ragged gasps as he gripped Sarah's hand, practically dragging her forward. Her foot caught on a root, and she stumbled, nearly falling again, but she managed to stay on her feet. The creature's heavy footsteps thundered behind them, and David could feel its presence closing in, like death itself, lurking just out of sight. Ahead of them, Jake led the charge, his torch flickering wildly as he pushed through the final stretch of trees toward the clearing. "We're almost there," he shouted, his voice hoarse from the exertion. "Don't look back, just run." But despite his command, Amanda couldn't resist. She glanced over her shoulder, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The creature was closer than she could have imagined. Its massive, hulking form was barely visible in the darkness, but its glowing yellow eyes burned through the night like twin embers of hell. It moved with unnatural speed, its long, sinewy limbs tearing through the underbrush with terrifying ease. "Oh my God," Amanda gasped, her legs faltering as fear gripped her chest. "It's right behind us. Keep moving," David yelled, pulling Sarah even harder as she struggled to keep up. They burst through the final line of trees and into the clearing. The cars sat like silent sentinels in the moonlight, but the distance between them and safety still felt impossibly far. David's heart raced as he saw the old Jeep that Jake had driven, parked haphazardly next to his own pickup. The keys were still in his pocket. If they could just reach the truck. But the creature wasn't slowing down. As the group reached the clearing, Jake spun around, brandishing the burning torch in front of him like a weapon. His eyes darted toward the others. "Get to the cars. I'll hold it off." "Are you insane?" Amanda shouted, her voice breaking with fear. "You can't fight that thing. We don't have a choice." Jake snapped. "Get in the cars, now." David hesitated, but only for a moment. The primal instinct to survive took over. He shoved Sarah toward the truck. "Go! Get inside." But before they could reach it, the creature lunged again. This time, it didn't miss. With a roar that shook the earth, the thing emerged from the shadows and slammed into Jake, sending him flying across the clearing. His torch went spinning through the air, landing in the dirt several feet away, its flames sputtering out. Jake's body hit the ground with a sickening thud, the air knocked from his lungs as he struggled to recover. "Jake!" Tyler screamed, skidding to a halt. David's mind raced as he saw the creature for the first time in full view. It was even worse than he had imagined, tall, towering above them, its body covered in matted, dark fur that gleamed in the moonlight. Its limbs were grotesquely long, ending in razor-sharp claws that gleamed with malice. Its face, twisted and monstrous, was an abomination of animalistic features, fangs glistening, nostrils flaring, and those sickening, glowing eyes that seemed to pierce straight through their souls. Jake tried to scramble to his feet, but the creature was on him in an instant. It moved with terrifying speed, its claws slashing through the air as it pinned him to the ground. Jake let out a strangled yell as the beast loomed over him, its jaws snapping dangerously close to his face. "Get in the truck!" David roared, shoving Sarah toward the vehicle. He turned to help Jake, but Tyler grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "We have to go!" Tyler cried, his voice filled with panic. "We can't just leave him," Amanda shouted, but her voice was drowned out by the deafening roar of the creature as it lashed out at Jake again. Jake swung wildly with his knife, but it was futile. The beast swatted the weapon aside like it was nothing. David's mind screamed for him to run, to leave Jake and save himself. But he couldn't. Not yet. With a surge of desperation, David grabbed a nearby rock and hurled it at the creature's head. "Hey! Over here," he shouted, hoping to distract it for just a second. The rock struck the creature's shoulder, but it barely flinched. It turned its head toward David, its glowing eyes locking onto him with murderous intent. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. David's breath caught in his throat as he stared into those unnatural eyes, eyes that didn't belong in this world. "Run, you idiot!" Jake shouted, his voice hoarse as he struggled beneath the creature's massive weight. The spell was broken. David turned and sprinted toward the truck. The others were already inside, Sarah in the passenger seat, Tyler and Amanda crammed into the back. The engine roared to life as David fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so violently that it took 2 tries to start the truck. The creature let out another bone-rattling roar, its attention still split between David and Jake. But before it could make a decision, Jake moved. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, Jake shoved his arm into the creature's side, jabbing the hunting knife deep into its flesh. The beast howled in pain, its body jerking violently as it reared up on its hind legs, momentarily releasing Jake from its grasp. "Now, Dave!" Jake screamed, his voice raw with agony. David slammed the truck into gear and floored the gas pedal. The tires spun in the dirt for a heart-stopping moment before they caught, sending the truck rocketing forward. They sped past Jake, who was limping desperately toward the Jeep. But the creature wasn't done yet. With an enraged snarl, it turned and charged after the truck. David's heart pounded in his chest as he watched it close the distance in the rearview mirror. It was faster than he could have ever imagined. The truck roared down the dirt road, headlights cutting through the thick darkness of the forest, but the creature was gaining. "It's still coming!" Amanda screamed, her face pale with terror. "Faster, Dave!" Tyler shouted, his voice barely holding together. "I'm going as fast as I can." David yelled back, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The truck rattled and bumped over the rough road, but he kept the pedal to the floor, pushing the vehicle to its limit. But no matter how fast they went, the creature didn't stop. It barreled after them with terrifying speed, its massive form illuminated by the dim glow of the taillights. David's heart pounded as the road ahead curved sharply to the right. If he didn't slow down, they would crash, but if he slowed down, the creature would reach them. "Hold on," he shouted, yanking the steering wheel hard to the right. The truck skidded, tires screeching as it careened around the bend, nearly tipping over before slamming back down onto the road. The sudden jolt sent everyone lurching forward, but they managed to stay in their seats. The creature was still behind them, its glowing eyes burning through the darkness. And then, just as they came out of the bend, the road opened up. The dense trees gave way to a straight path, and in the distance, David saw it, a narrow bridge that crossed over a ravine. It was old, rickety, barely wide enough for the truck to pass through, but it was their only chance. "That bridge looks like it's about to collapse," Sarah screamed, clutching the dashboard. "We don't have a choice," David yelled. He gunned the engine again, the truck roaring as it sped toward the bridge. The creature, undeterred, let out another deafening roar as it continued its relentless pursuit. The distance between them and the monster was closing fast. Too fast. The truck hit the bridge with a bone-rattling jolt. The wooden planks creaked ominously beneath the weight of the vehicle, but David didn't stop. The engine whined as they hurtled across, the sound of the creature's pounding footsteps growing louder and louder behind them. And then, just as they reached the middle of the bridge, David heard it, the unmistakable sound of splintering wood. The bridge was collapsing. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the night as the rickety bridge gave way beneath the truck's weight. David's heart leapt into his throat as he felt the entire vehicle lurch downward, the wooden planks cracking and snapping beneath the tires. For a terrifying second, he thought the truck would plunge into the ravine, but the front wheels managed to stay on the remaining planks, screeching as they clung to the edge. "David!" Sarah screamed, her hands gripping the dashboard as the truck swayed violently. Behind them, the creature let out another bone-chilling roar, its footsteps pounding toward them with terrifying speed. David didn't dare look back. His focus was entirely on the narrow path ahead, the crumbling bridge beneath them, and the gap that was widening with every second. Come on," he muttered through gritted teeth, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel, forcing the truck forward. The engine roared as the tires spun, struggling to find traction on the decaying wood. The truck groaned under the strain, the wooden beams of the bridge snapping like brittle bones beneath them. The creature was almost on them now, its massive form charging across the bridge with terrifying momentum. The truck rocked as another section of the bridge collapsed behind them, sending debris crashing into the ravine below. David pressed the gas pedal to the floor, but the truck wasn't moving fast enough. "We're not going to make it," Amanda cried from the back seat, her voice trembling with fear. But just as the rear wheels hit the final planks, the truck surged forward, its tires gripping the last stretch of solid wood. With a jarring crash, they made it across, the bridge collapsing completely behind them as the truck lurched onto solid ground. David slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt. They had made it, barely. The creature let out a furious roar, but as the group looked back, they saw it hesitate at the edge of the ruined bridge. The wooden planks had fallen into the ravine, leaving nothing but a gaping void between them and the creature. For the first time, the beast seemed unsure. It paced along the edge of the chasm, its glowing yellow eyes locked onto the group. It snarled, frustrated, its massive claws scraping the dirt as it realized it couldn't reach them. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. We made it." David's heart was still pounding in his chest, his hands shaking on the wheel. He could barely process what had just happened. The truck's engine idled loudly, filling the oppressive silence that followed the creature's roar. Jake, limping but alive, slumped in the passenger seat. His face was pale, smeared with dirt and blood, but his eyes were sharp, still locked on the beast across the ravine. "That was too close," he muttered. Tyler, sitting in the back seat, let out a nervous laugh. "Too close? That thing almost killed us." "Not yet," Jake replied grimly, his gaze never leaving the creature. The beast roared again, a sound of pure, primal rage that reverberated through the trees. It paced back and forth, as if considering whether it could make the leap across the ravine. Its eyes remained fixed on the group, filled with a hunger that hadn't been satisfied. Is it going to jump?" Amanda asked, her voice trembling as she stared at the creature, her hand gripping the seat so hard her knuckles were white. "It can't make that jump," David said, trying to convince himself as much as the others. "It's too far." But even as he said the words, doubt crept into his mind. The thing wasn't like any animal he had ever seen before. It moved too fast, too unnaturally. Who was to say it couldn't leap across the ravine in one terrifying bound? Suddenly, the beast stopped pacing. It lowered its massive body, coiling its muscles like a predator preparing to pounce. "Oh no," Sarah gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. The creature let out a final, deafening roar, and then it launched itself into the air. For a split second, it seemed to hang there, suspended above the ravine, its glowing eyes locked onto the group with murderous intent. Time seemed to slow, and in that horrible moment, David realized the thing was going to make it. "Floor it!" Jake screamed, slamming his fist on the dashboard. David didn't need to be told twice. He slammed his foot down on the gas pedal, the truck roaring as it shot forward, tires screeching against the dirt road. The creature crashed into the spot where the truck had been only seconds earlier, its claws digging into the ground with a sickening thud. "Go, go, go!" Amanda screamed from the back seat, her voice nearly drowned out by the sound of the beast's enraged howls. The truck careened down the narrow road, its engine roaring as David pushed it to its limits. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the creature give chase again, its massive form tearing through the underbrush with terrifying speed. The ravine hadn't stopped it. Nothing would. "It's still coming," Tyler shouted, his eyes wide with panic. David's heart pounded in his chest as the road twisted and turned through the dense forest. Every sharp bend felt like it would be their last, the truck skidding dangerously close to the trees as he struggled to maintain control. "It's gaining on us," Sarah cried, looking back at the creature as it barreled toward them, getting closer with every second. "We need a plan," Jake shouted, his voice filled with urgency. "We can't outrun it forever." David scanned the road ahead, but there was nothing, just more trees, more endless darkness. The headlights barely cut through the thick fog that seemed to have settled over the forest, making everything ahead look like a blur. Suddenly, Tyler shouted from the back seat, "There! Look!" David's eyes darted to where Tyler was pointing. Up ahead, through the fog, a narrow path veered sharply to the right, leading off the main road and into the deeper part of the forest. It was barely visible, overgrown with brush and branches, but it was something. Without hesitating, David yanked the wheel to the right, sending the truck careening off the road and onto the hidden path. The tires bounced violently over rocks and roots, the underbrush scraping against the sides of the vehicle as they tore through the narrow trail. "What the hell are you doing?" Amanda screamed as the truck jolted over a particularly large rock. David didn't answer. His focus was entirely on the path ahead, on the one slim chance they had to lose the creature. The path was barely wide enough for the truck, and every turn felt like they were about to collide with a tree, but they had to try something. Behind them, the creature let out another enraged roar. It had followed them off the main road, crashing through the dense foliage with terrifying strength. But the narrowness of the trail seemed to slow it down. It couldn't move as fast through the tight space, its massive body crashing against the trees and underbrush as it struggled to keep up. "It's working!" Sarah shouted, her voice filled with desperate hope. "It's getting stuck." But David knew it wouldn't last. The creature was relentless. It would find a way through, and when it did, the truck burst into another clearing, this one small, with no clear exit on the other side. David slammed on the brakes, the vehicle skidding to a stop. The clearing was surrounded by dense forest on all sides, with no obvious path leading out. They were trapped. "No," Amanda whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "No, no, no. It's a dead end," Jake muttered, his face pale as he stared at the wall of trees that surrounded them. David's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. The creature was close, too close. They could hear it crashing through the woods behind them, tearing through the narrow path with renewed fury. There was no time to turn the truck around, no time to escape. "This is it," Mike muttered from the back seat, his voice hollow. "We're done." But David refused to give up. He jumped out of the truck, grabbing the shotgun from the back seat. "Everyone out. We make our stand here." "Are you insane?" Tyler yelled, his face contorted in fear. "We can't fight that thing. We don't have a choice." David snapped, his eyes wild. "It's either fight, or we die." The group scrambled out of the truck, their bodies trembling with fear as they gathered whatever weapons they could find, knives, branches, rocks. David cocked the shotgun, his hands shaking but determined. The creature's roars grew louder, closer. It was almost upon them. And then, from the darkness, it emerged, its massive, hulking form crashing into the clearing, its glowing eyes filled with rage. David raised the shotgun, his finger trembling on the trigger. "Come on," he he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Come and get us." The creature's roar echoed through the clearing, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. It emerged from the darkness like a nightmare-given form, its massive, hulking body illuminated by the weak glow of the truck's headlights. Its eyes, burning with that sickly yellow light, locked onto the group with a feral hunger. Every muscle in its grotesque form tensed as it prepared to strike. David stood at the front, the shotgun clutched tightly in his hands. His heart pounded in his chest, and his breath came in quick, shallow gasps. He had never felt fear like this before, raw, primal, the kind that made his hands shake and his thoughts blur. But there was no running now. This was it. "Stay together," David shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "We make a stand here." Jake, limping but determined, gripped his hunting knife with white knuckles. His eyes, though bloodshot and filled with pain, held the same fierce resolve as David's. He knew that if they were going to survive, they couldn't show weakness, not now. Sarah stood beside David, her hands trembling as she held a large branch like a club. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Amanda and Tyler were next to her, both pale and shaking, their makeshift weapons looking pitiful against the size of the beast they now faced. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, its breath visible in the cold night air. It paced slowly, its glowing eyes flicking between each member of the group as if sizing them up. Its long, twisted limbs moved with unnatural grace, muscles rippling beneath its dark, matted fur. There was an intelligence in those eyes, something more than just a predator. Something malevolent. David's finger trembled on the trigger of the shotgun. He had only 2 shots. He couldn't afford to miss. With a sudden burst of speed, the creature lunged. David fired. The shotgun blast rang out through the clearing, the sound deafening. The shot hit the creature square in the chest, and for a moment, David thought he had done it. The beast stumbled back, a pained roar escaping its throat as dark blood splattered onto the ground. But it didn't fall. Instead, the creature snarled, its eyes blazing with fury. It shook off the impact like it was nothing, the wound barely slowing it down. And then, with terrifying speed, it charged again. "Run!" David screamed, firing the second shot, but the creature dodged to the side, too fast for him to aim properly. The blast went wide, missing the beast by inches. Before he could react, the creature was upon him. With a swipe of its massive claws, it knocked the shotgun from David's hands, sending him crashing to the ground. Pain exploded in his side as he hit the dirt, the wind knocked from his lungs. He gasped for air, his vision blurring as the creature loomed over him, its fangs bared, ready to strike. But before the creature could land the killing blow, Jake was there. With a primal scream, Jake drove his hunting knife deep into the beast's side, twisting the blade as he slammed his body into the creature. The beast howled in pain, turning its attention away from David and toward Jake. It lashed out with its claws, slashing across Jake's chest in a brutal arc. Jake staggered back, blood pouring from the deep gashes, but he didn't fall. "Get up, David!" Jake roared, his voice hoarse with pain. "We're not dead yet." David scrambled to his feet, his body screaming in protest as he reached for the shotgun. But the creature was faster. With a snarl, it lunged at Jake, knocking him to the ground. Its jaws snapped inches from Jake's face, saliva dripping from its fangs as it prepared to tear him apart. "Jake!" Sarah screamed, but before she could rush to help, Amanda and Tyler grabbed her, pulling her back. "David!" Amanda shouted, panic rising in her voice. "Do something!" David's mind raced. The shotgun was useless now, he had no more shells. Desperation clawed at him as he searched for anything that could help. His eyes fell on the truck, its headlights still illuminating the creature as it pinned Jake to the ground. And then it hit him. "Tyler, get the flare!" David shouted. Tyler, wide-eyed and trembling, didn't move at first. "The what?" "The flare," David repeated, his voice frantic. "In the truck. Hurry!" Tyler snapped out of his daze and scrambled to the truck. He yanked open the glove compartment, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the contents. Finally, his fingers closed around the small emergency flare. He tossed it to David just as the creature let out another roar, its claws sinking into Jake's shoulder. Jake's scream echoed through the clearing, the sound of it sending a shockwave of terror through the group. "Get away from him!" David roared, igniting the flare. The bright, burning light flared to life, casting an eerie red glow across the clearing. The creature's head snapped toward David, its eyes narrowing in the sudden burst of light. It snarled, momentarily distracted by the brightness. David didn't waste any time. He charged forward, the flare held high, and slammed it directly into the beast's face. The creature howled in agony as the flare burned its flesh, the intense light searing its eyes. It reared back, thrashing wildly, its claws swinging through the air as it tried to escape the burning heat. David shoved the flare deeper, forcing the beast to retreat. "Get Jake!" David shouted to the others as the creature stumbled backward, its movements frantic. Sarah and Amanda rushed forward, grabbing Jake and pulling him away from the creature's reach. Blood poured from his wounds, but his eyes were still open, his chest heaving with labored breaths. He was alive, for now. The creature let out one final, furious roar before it turned and fled into the dark woods, crashing through the trees with a speed that defied its size. The sound of its retreating footsteps faded into the distance, leaving the group in stunned silence. For a long moment, no one moved. The clearing was eerily quiet, the only sound the crackling of the burning flare and the ragged breathing of the survivors. David dropped the flare, his hands shaking as the adrenaline finally began to wear off. His legs felt like they were about to give out, but he forced himself to stay upright, his eyes scanning the dark tree line, half expecting the creature to return. But it didn't. "It's gone," Amanda whispered, her voice trembling. Is it really gone?" David nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure himself. "For now." Sarah knelt beside Jake, tears streaming down her face as she pressed her hands to the gashes on his chest, trying to stop the bleeding. "We need to get him to a hospital," she said, her voice shaking with panic. David nodded again, his mind still racing. "We will. But first, we get the hell out of here." With trembling hands, David helped the others lift Jake into the back of the truck. He was pale, barely conscious, but alive. That was enough. They piled into the truck, and David gunned the engine one last time, the tires spinning as they tore out of the clearing and back onto the dirt road. The forest seemed quieter now, the oppressive darkness no longer pressing in on them. But even as they sped away, the terror of what had happened lingered in the air. No one spoke. No one dared to. It wasn't until they had reached the safety of the highway, miles away from the forest, that Sarah finally broke the silence. "What the hell was that thing?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. David shook his head, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I don't know. But whatever it was, I don't think it's the last we'll see of it." The others exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of his words settling over them like a dark cloud. They had survived the night. But the nightmare wasn't over. So, what did you think of this terrifying story? I hope you enjoyed this journey filled with suspense and mystery. If you did, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more chilling stories just like this one. And make sure to hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time, if you dare.